Okay, let's start with a really provocative thought. What if the traditions that are supposed to explain ancient laws were actually created to, well, to change them? Today, we're diving into a really sharp critique of the relationship between Judaism's written Torah and its oral tradition. It's an argument that really questions the very foundation of how these texts have been interpreted for centuries.
So it all boils down to this one question from our source material. What if our tradition came to nullify the practice of the commandments? Think about that. The question isn't whether the tradition explains the commandments, but whether it fundamentally changes how or even if they're physically performed. It's a huge claim, right? So let's dig in and see the evidence the author presents.
All right, before we go any further, let's just make sure we're on the same page with the two key players here. You've got the written Torah, that's the 5 books of Moses, the foundational text, and then you have the oral Torah, this huge body of rabbinic interpretation, think the Talmud and so on, which traditionally is there to explain and elaborate on that written text. It's the relationship between these two that's at the heart of this whole discussion.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with some examples from daily rituals, then we'll get into the how, the mechanics of how these changes supposedly happened. From there, we'll look at some bigger societal laws, and finally, we'll get to the author's final, pretty shocking verdict.
All right, let's jump right in with our first case study, daily rituals. The source starts its argument by looking at a couple of really common, everyday commandments to see if a pattern starts to show up.
First up, grace after meals. You know, the blessing after you eat. The command in the written Torah seems pretty straightforward, right? It says, "And you shall eat and be satisfied and bless the Lord your God." Simple enough.
Okay, so here's where the author starts to build their case. The written commandment, as we just saw, is to bless after any satisfying meal. But the practice we see today, which comes from the oral law, says the full blessing is really only required for a meal that includes bread. Now, the author's claim is that this one little detail, the bread, effectively puts a major restriction on the original, much broader command. So here's the result, according to the source. By narrowing the rules like that, the tradition basically makes sure that for tons of other satisfying meals, ones that just don't happen to have bread, the original commandment, as it's written, just isn't performed anymore. The physical action has been changed.
Okay, let's look at another one, another daily ritual, the mezuzah. And again, the text from the Torah seems super direct. Write these words on the doorposts of your house.
And this is where the author's pattern really starts to pop. The command is to write on the doorposts. But what's the practice? Well, we write on a piece of parchment, we put it in a case, and then we attach the case to the doorpost. You see the difference? According to the source, this totally changes the action. The doorpost itself, the specific thing mentioned in the Torah, is left completely blank.
And that's the real kicker for this example. People absolutely believe they are fulfilling the mitzvah, but the literal, physical act described in the Torah, writing directly on the doorframe, has been swapped out for something else entirely. In the author's view, the original practice has been, well, nullified.
Okay, so this naturally leads to a really big question. If this critique is right, how on earth did these fundamental changes even happen? What was the mechanism behind it all?
Yeah, exactly. How could traditions that seem to completely change the direct meaning of the text get so widely accepted without anyone batting an eye? Well, the source suggests it was a two-step process.
So according to the author, step 1 was all about legitimacy. The claim was made that the oral law also came from God to Moses at Sinai, which of course gives it divine authority. Step 2 was to mask the intent. How? By adding a ton of new stuff, prayers, safeguards, extra interpretations, all of which could be framed as being just extra pious, you know? Good intentions, not fundamental changes.
Now, the author argues that this isn't just about a few daily rituals here and there. Nope. They claim this exact same pattern, this practical nullification, extends to major societal and financial laws too.
And this is where you can really see the alleged pattern widening. Take an eye for an eye. The written law says that, but the oral law famously interprets it as monetary compensation. Or how about sabbatical debt cancellation? The written law is clear. Every 7 years, debts are wiped clean. But the oral law created a legal workaround called a prosbul that lets lenders get around that rule. Same thing with interest. The Torah forbids charging interest, but a heter iska permit was created to structure a loan more like a business deal, allowing for a profit that acts just like interest. In every single one of these cases, the author's claim is the same. A direct command is neatly sidestepped with a clever legal tool.
So, All of this brings us to the author's final verdict. This is the core thesis that ties all these examples together into one big argument.
And this right here is probably the most important idea in the whole critique. The author isn't saying that the laws were erased from the books. Not at all. The argument is about what's called the nullification of practice. The law can stay right there on the page, but the physical action a person actually does is changed so much that it no longer matches the original command, and often they think they're fulfilling it perfectly.
And so here it is. The author's final, explosive conclusion is that the Oral Torah, with all its new interpretations and practices, isn't just an explanation of the original covenant. It actually functions as a replacement, a whole new covenant, just with a much more convincing name.
So we're left with this massive question, one that's really at the heart of any living tradition. Where do you draw the line? At what point does the essential act of interpreting and applying ancient texts cross over and become a fundamental transformation of the original thing? It's a question that really challenges us to think about the nature of text, tradition, and what we actually do.